All right, so we here on the Vinyl Guide, we're always happy when we get guests joining us that were part of music history. And today, I must say, we're doubly delighted because we're getting to talk with someone who was a very integral part of Frank Zappa's band during what is really considered Frank's golden period. We have on the phone Ralph Humphrey, who is really my favorite drummer of the Zappa universe. How are you today, Frank? How are you today? How are you today, Ralph?
Frank won't be answering anytime soon, unfortunately. I am fine, thank you, and thank you for the compliment.
Oh, no worries. No, you are my favorite. Just don't tell Terry Bozzio I said that, or Chad Wackerman. No, I'm kidding. No, really, I think it's Ralph. You again were in Zappa's band during this really accessible period, I guess. The Overnite Sensation, Apostrophe, Roxy and Elsewhere. How did you come to join Frank's band?
Well, George Duke was an old friend of mine. We're both from the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. And, of course, he was with the Mothers for some time and was an integral part of that whole band. And he called me up one day. I'd been touring with Don Ellis's big band for about 5 years and doing recordings with that band and kind of learning what I consider, how I learned how to play drums and bring myself into the modern world was playing in that band. And so I'd sort of been off the road, and I was thinking about what's next, stay in town. I had an opportunity, I think at that time. I'm sorry, that was later. So George calls me up one day and says, Frank's looking for a drummer. He's heard many drummers here in town, and he has not found anybody yet. Why don't you come down and check it out? Mm-hmm. And of course, I had never even considered playing with Frank, and I wasn't that familiar with his music even at that point. I certainly knew of him. I knew that he was sort of a radical in terms of musician, doing some way different stuff. And because I had been playing with Don Ellis's band, which was doing some way different stuff than normal, I felt, well, I probably could handle it okay, because I think I have now some experience, and maybe this would be something that I would like. And so I said, okay, I'll come down. And so he had a rehearsal studio on Sunset Boulevard, very famous sort of warehouse, and I went down there, and the band was there rehearsing, and there was no other drummer there at the time, so it was just me. And I sat down, and I can't recall the exact order that things went down, but I think maybe the first tune was just jamming on some riff or whatever, just for him to get used to hearing what I sound like and how I was going to, relate to everybody, especially him.
How you'd fit in, what you could bring to the mix, yeah?
Exactly. What am I going to bring? And he didn't know who I was at all. So he took George's recommendation. And so I played, and I know that part of that audition, and it was a fairly extensive audition, I have to say. I played 4 or 5 different things. One included some reading, which was probably the most difficult thing, because Frank's music is not sight readable by most standards, and I was a good reader. I am a good reader, so I did my best, but that doesn't mean that I did 100%. And then we jammed in 7, I believe. Mm-hmm. We played some kind of up-tempo stuff. The whole band was playing the whole time, and I was, I knew how to relate to other musicians. I had pretty good experience. I'd been on the road. I'd and learned about all that whole thing, and so I wasn't afraid, and I was pretty comfortable, because I think my attitude was, I don't even know if he offered it to me, would I say yes? I was sort of very casual about it, so it wasn't like I got to have this gig.
So did you cram or prepare? Did you pick up a copy of Hot Rats or anything? Or?
I did no preparation. I just walked in, and because I don't know. I guess playing with Don Ellis. Do you know anything about Don Ellis?
I do not.
Okay. Well, maybe you should do some investigating in that. Great trumpet player, had a big band. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, that whole experience was so challenging and so demanding on me that I felt like, well, if I can do this, I can do anything. So I kind of went into the audition feeling pretty darn cocky, if I can use that word,
Sure.
because I just felt, well, I think I know how to do this. I've got everything I think I need to do this. So did the rehearsal, did the audition, and basically Frank hired me on the spot.
Hmm.
He liked what he heard. He saw the potential in terms of me being able to read his stuff, being able to play on odd meters, being able to relate to the band, being able to take direction, all that sort of thing. So I said yes, on the spot. I said, well, okay, this is going to be fun because who was in the band? George Duke, Jean-Luc Ponty, Ian and Ruth Underwood, Tom and Bruce Fowler, Sal Marquez on trumpet. I mean, what a band.
Did you know any of them besides George Duke going into it?
I knew Sal. I knew Bruce and Tom. I didn't know Ian and Ruth before then.
So he offered you the gig on the spot. You accepted on the spot.
I did.
Okay.
Yes.
And what was the first thing that you guys did as a unit? Did you go? Were the songs on Overnight or any of the other material already ready, just waiting to put in a drummer, or was that starting to be built at that time?
I think some of it might have been ready, and then some of it was being built. We kind of built everything from the ground up in the rehearsals. So we hit all that material and other material that did not end up on that record, but ended up on various different cuts after that in various different packages. So yeah, we rehearsed all those tunes and went on the road, uh, and then we came back and recorded. And the recording was at Bollock Studios, Ike Turner's studio in Los Angeles. Um, and Frank liked to record everybody at the same time. And then he would go and do his magic, of course, on it. And yeah, there were some overdubs, for sure. But the band as a whole would lay down the tracks. I think Frank liked the sort of organicness of all that. And I'm kind of glad that he did because I hate doing things piecemeal. It just loses something. So and Frank being Frank was very, he wanted to hear things exactly the way he wanted to hear them. And so, through rehearsals and through several takes in the studio, we finally got what he wanted. And then he would go home and do his magic. And then next thing you know, Overnite Sensation is ready to go. And I was using at the time a Pearl fiberglass drum set, which I used on my first tour with him. And yeah, I thought it worked out pretty well. The first thing Frank did was he put a Barkus Berry pickup in my snare drum, my metal snare drum. So he had to drill a hole and put a jack in there. So because he wanted to amplify the drums electrically. Mm-hmm. So each drum was sort of being amplified individually. What on the road, it kind of created a less than nice sound. It got a lot of attack and plenty of volume, but it didn't. The drums themselves didn't have the same warmth, perhaps, just by miking them. But in the studio, I think he just used regular microphones. But the unique thing about Frank is that what he did with my drum set sound in the mix, with compression and everything, all the other treatment, it really made them sound nice and snug and tight and clear, and so I thought what I played was appropriate for how he mixed, and the ultimate drum sound that he got. And so part of that record for me, the enjoyment of part of the record is the sound of the drums, what Frank did to the sound of the drums.
It is a very warm sounding drum. The drum tracks they're very pleasing. They're also it's a departure for the type of drumming or really the type of musicianship that Frank had prior to that record, because the instruments became an extension of the voice, where rather than kind of the background for the guitar solos or the other
Right.
the other instruments.
And the other unique thing about that band was because I mean, Frank had prejudices and attitudes, and I know he would half jokingly say that he hated jazz, I think he hated traditional bebop jazz. Uh, but the interesting thing was that he surrounded himself in that band with jazz players because we were the only people that could even come close to playing his music or read his music.
And his attitude toward bebop jazz, was it, did he think it was phony? Did he think it was too high minded?
No, I don't think so. I think he thought it was boring.
And in this period of time, now, the sequence, if I recall correct, and correct me if I'm wrong here, the sequence is Overnite Sensation in 73,
Yeah,
then Apostrophe in 74, and
correct.
Roxy, I think later 74, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Overnight Sensation was really his first heavy vocal album since his accident in the UK.
Uh huh.
Did you see any directive energies towards doing that? Did he was it deliberate that he wanted the record to have a departure from the instrumental records he recorded after his accident?
I don't know if anything had to do with his accident. My feeling is that he he always felt that he should have been more popular than he was and should have made more money than he did. And so my feeling was that this is as close to a pop record that he got, where the songs were tight, contained, not too long, um,
Accessible.
accessible. Exactly. Whereas the other stuff, a lot of the other stuff that he was doing was less accessible, in terms of all that.
Which actually worked quite well because so many people use those three albums as their entry point into Frank's work. So it sounds like that was a deliberate decision to do that sort of a commercial accessibility. A track like Dynamo Hum, which I think he built his
With
career.
exceptions.
Yeah, well, that really was kind of what a lot of people know him for.
I know.
What came first? The concept of Dynamo Hum, did it just start organically as a jam? How did that come to be?
No, I think Frank had this 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 lyric, if you want to call it a lyric, because it's fantastic what it is. So he decided how am I going to put this to the music? So he had this groove, this basic kind of beat that was going on, and then told the story on that groove, and then inserted little elements to spice it up, and I mean it was genius. I thought the story is just a great little story.
So while you were playing the backing track, you knew exactly what he was going to be saying. The arc of the story, I guess.
Well, I'm trying to remember if we did that on the road before we recorded it, and I can't remember. I really can't remember that. It's a long time ago. So I would have to say it could have been that we played some of that material for the first time. We never played it on the road, but we played it in the studio for the first time. But obviously we had rehearsed it, because I don't remember rehearsing in the studio. We went into the studio to record.
And it was all business in the studio.
It was business in the studio, yeah. And Frank wanted things exactly how he wanted them. And once he had it, it was great. On to the next. And believe it or not, because we were so well rehearsed, it didn't take us long to get the tracks.
And when you heard the end result, when you got the copy of the Overnight Sensation record, was any of it surprising, or that was pretty much as it was expected?
That's a good question. I the record a lot. I think it's just a genius piece of work. The tunes are, really cool. They're funny. I like all the grooves. I just like it all. I like the drum sound. Everybody's playing is great. And yet it seems to have a carefreeness about it at the same time. But a lot of work went into it, obviously.
Oh yeah. Well, we've talked with Don Preston and some other musicians before, and they'd said that when they recorded with Frank, he took segments of what they played and assembled it in post-production. So when they got the record, only then when they saw Frank's vision.
Right. Well, I know that he did a lot of work like that, but these particular tracks were not like that.
Yeah.
These were through composed. I don't know that he did much editing unless he edited from one take to the next, which he could have done.
Right.
But that's the way we recorded them is the way they ended up. So Frank must not have done much of that.
No, fair enough. Yeah, they do sound like single compositions. They're not the sonic soundscapes that he's done on other works. Now, in terms of the studio work there, these albums seem to be heavier in some of the studio trickery, pitch shifters and that sort of thing. Were those new toys that Frank was working with at the time?
He always seemed to have the latest elements to work with. Of course, his studio was pretty together, and he did a lot of work in his studio in post, and so yeah, he had a lot of little tricks and things like that he was aware of that he was using, and I do remember one engineer that he used a lot. His name was Kerry McNabb. He would do a lot of his recording, and probably he picked up some tricks from Kerry. But Frank was a genius, and I'm sure he tried all sorts of different things to create effects and things like that. Speeding up the tape, for example, and other things that created more unique kinds of sounds as opposed to organic live sounds.
In those records, I guess he had some credited and some uncredited help. You guys were recording at Ike Turner Studio, and Tina Turner and the Ikettes participated. Right. What were your memories around them doing the backup vocals?
I was not present when they did those, so they were overdubbed.
So once the basic tracks were done, Frank just said, "Okay, I'm going to work on this. I'll see you guys in a few weeks." And
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Same with Ricky Lancelotti for
Ricky
Zombie Wolf,
Lancelotti for 50-50?
Yeah.
Yeah. Crazy Ricky Lancelotti. A unique character.
How did he come into the fold?
Well, I don't know exactly where Frank found him. It just seemed like Frank always knew of certain people that he, people either turned him on to them or whatever. But suddenly there was Ricky Lancelotti in the mix, and Frank, Frank loves unique characters and all that sort of thing. So he thought he would be perfect for that track. Mm-hmm. And as it was, he was perfect for that track. That's a very over the top.
No, absolutely.
Track. A lot of energy in that one.
He was a voiceover artist that kind of made his way into the Zappa universe and then exited just as quickly.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
And some of the references that were in some of those albums through Frank's work, sometimes he just gets stuck on these concepts. You'll hear some of his bootlegs to where just one night they're talking about a razor blade commercial they must have seen earlier that day. He was stuck on a few concepts, ponchos and tweezers. Any thoughts about what got those concepts into his head during that time?
Probably everything came from real life situations, so the poncho, there must have been a girl maybe that he met or was with that had this Sears looking poncho, and so he thought he would make a joke out of it. Or as far as the tweezers thing, I'm really not sure where that came from, but he was a brilliant storyteller, and he would come up with these lines that were just, oh, what a great line.
Yeah, I was just interested to see if there was a source for his tweezers or whatever. At that point, he had
There could have been. There definitely could have been a source.
It's been lost to time, though.
Most of Frank's stories come from real life.
Did you guys record Overnite Sensation and Apostrophe in parallel, or was it one after the other?
I think we probably did, and again, I don't remember this. I know that we would go into the studio and record. Mm-hmm. How these recordings were going to end up, none of us ever knew. I know that we knew that the bulk of the Overnite Sensation tracks, that was going to be a record.
Mm-hmm.
But after that, like Yellow Snow and Cosmic Debris and other things that ended up on Apostrophe, ended up being a compilation, of course, over the course. And I remember going into the studio and recording these things, but I didn't know how they were going to end up. And the fact that Apostrophe came out, which was not under the Mothers of Invention, it was Frank's record, and so he just took from this and from that and put it all together and made this record. But we would play the whole sequence of St. Alfonso's and Yellow Snow and all that, and Cosmic Debris. We would do that constantly on the road.
Mm-hmm.
So that lived on.
And what was the delineation between what was a Frank and the Mothers record versus what was a Frank solo record?
Well, I don't know. That was definitely Frank's call. I don't know why he did that. Maybe he thought, well, this record is not being played by my band. It's being played by my band and some by other people, session players that he called in for one-offs.
So it wasn't that he had a contractual obligation to do X amount for the Mothers or start a Frank Zappa solo album. They're both on the same label. They're both on Discreet.
Yeah. Well, Discreet was his label, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So I always thought Frank could do whatever he wanted.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I always felt like.
Okay, so when one record came out as Frank Zappa and the Mothers, and the other one came out as Frank Zappa, it was immaterial.
Immaterial.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. I was happy to be on it.
Yes, and we're glad you were on it as well. Those are fantastic records. Now, then we start to lead up to the Roxy and Elsewhere period. Mm-hmm. That material was largely recorded live in Los Angeles. What was the decision like to not go into the studio for the recording of those tracks?
Well, part of that record was tracks from The Road. More Trouble Every Day. We did that in where did we do that? Back east somewhere, Edinburgh, New York. That was a show we did back there, and this track just happened to come off so great that he decided to put it on the record. And then the rest of it was recorded live at the Roxy, which was also being filmed.
Yep.
So, and do you know the story of the film and
At a very high level, I've seen it. I know it's been hidden for many years and just came out last year. But please tell us the details.
Well, so we recorded. I mean, it was a 4-camera shoot, and the cameramen were moving around the stage, and there were issues right from the get-go. There was a problem with synchronization between audio and video. And so that was the biggest problem right there. And it took many, many years to solve that problem because technology didn't solve it at that time. Because I think Frank's idea was to, we're going to film this and I'm going to put it out. And the fact that it didn't come out was because there were issues, there were technical problems with the whole thing. So Live at the Roxy and Elsewhere, that record came out, but the film stayed in the vault for all these years because it had issues. So some of what you heard on Live at the Roxy and Elsewhere did not make it to the ultimate film because I don't think Frank wanted to, or there was some sort of contractual issue where he couldn't use the tracks from Live at the Roxy and Elsewhere on the movie. So the movie features tracks that are not on Live at the Roxy and Elsewhere. Mm. Same tunes, but a different night, a different take.
So the original concept for Live for Roxy and Elsewhere was to have a concert film and perhaps a soundtrack album to that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And then because of probably synchronization and maybe the frame rates and
all that sort of thing,
wandering, it's hard to put together.
Yeah, apparently, according to the directors of the film, there were so many issues that had to be resolved for this to happen, and it took
technical and legal.
Yes, exactly. And they worked on it for 2 years to resolve these problems until they finally got to a point where, okay, I think we got something. So they compiled the 4 nights. We recorded for 4 nights and basically, created a concert of the material
Mm.
in an hour and a half. Ruth Underwood and I talked about this whole thing a lot, and I kind of agree with her that a lot of what's on the film is less than what we did for the record. In other words, the playing is not as good, uh, uh, which is kind of a drag because you'd want your playing to be as possibly as good as ever. So yeah. So the tracks that ended up on the film were second takes. They
The
were
second
takes that
favorites. They
were
weren't the
second favorites. They weren't the first favorites. Exactly.
Gotcha. So you've seen the film. I guess you're okay with it, or are you? Is it not what you wanted to see up there?
No, we there was a screening here in Los Angeles at the Egyptian Theater in November of last year. Uh, Gail Zappa died 1 week before the screening, which was obviously tragic. She wanted to be there, and everybody wanted her to be there, and it didn't work out. She got quite ill at the end there, and didn't make it. So the screening was Amat and uh, Joe Travers, the Vaultmeister. Are you
Yep.
aware of
Yep.
Joe?
Hmm.
Okay, and so they were the presenters, and the directors were there. The two guys. I can't remember their names right now, but they had a Q&A after the filming. So um, the band members who were there were myself, Bruce Fowler, and Walt Fowler. George wasn't there because George had already died. Ruth wasn't there because Ruth was not. She was ill. Ian was not there because he was not in the band. Let's see. Yeah, I guess that's it.
Oh,
Napoleon Percy
Napoleon.
Brock. Napoleon was not there because Napoleon somehow ended up with having some sort of an issue with Frank. I don't know exactly what happened there, but there was some legal issue with Frank. I'm not quite sure what, but anyhow, so Walt and Bruce and I were the representatives of the band at the screening, and we joined the Q&A afterwards. And what I thought of the film, it's kind of like as I remember that concert going down. That's kind of like the sequence that we did things, and uh, it was 1974, so it's not the stellar production you would like it to be.
Hmm.
It's to me, it's a good representation of what went down during those concerts.
Mm.
It's like a documentary.
In terms of the actual the soundtrack, the original album, were there many overdubs? Was there much post production to those tracks?
I'm sure there was some, but I remember the band being able to pretty much accomplish all of the music and all of the parts on stage.
Hmm.
So if there was any post that went on, it would be to enhance. Like for example, I know that Frank would like to overdub on a synthesizer the xylophone parts, doubling the xylophone part
Hmm.
to make it stand out even more. Other than that, I'm sure he added other little bits and pieces, but I remember kind of hearing the tunes the way we played them.
With that perspective, Roxy makes much more sense now that it wasn't recorded in a studio and then performed live. It was to be performed live with the soundtrack, and that was going to be the revealing of those songs to the world during that.
Exactly.
Just
Yeah.
didn't come together that way
It
for
doesn't come
various
together.
reasons.
And it's quite possible that Frank, after realizing that he couldn't do what he wanted to do, decided, well, to complete this record, I have to bring in music from a road tape, you know, because he wasn't able to get everything he wanted from the music we recorded at the Roxy.
Okay, so there were a few cuts on Roxy and Elsewhere. I guess the Elsewhere cuts.
The Elsewhere cuts, exactly.
Okay, and which ones were those?
Well, Edinburgh for sure. Uh, that's the More Trouble Every Day, that whole sequence.
Yeah.
Uh, there might have been some others. I just can't recall what they were.
That was really, again, another high watermark for Zappa and the musicianship and the songs, but it sounds like it was perhaps a bit of a downer at the time because he couldn't fully realize that vision. Was Frank happy with the way Roxy turned out?
You mean at the time we did it?
Yes.
I would say no. I think he was a bit disturbed by the technical problems that happened that weren't supposed to happen. I mean, his thinking is, look, we're doing our job, now you do your job, and those folks didn't do their job. And so I'm sure it left him with some dismay, and he kind of realized that this is too daunting a task to worry about it right now. I'll just put it away and worry about it later, and at least put out the record, which is what he did, and the record came out, really, really nice.
And after that, you stopped playing with Frank's band. What was that separation?
Well, let me back up.
Okay.
So I was the sole drummer up until Chester joined, and Frank. It was Frank's band, so everybody else was a sideman, and you made certain assumptions. Yeah, I'm gonna get called to do the rehearsal, blah blah blah, and so after we do Overnite Sensation and tracks for the Apostrophe, and we went on the road, we came back, took a break, and it was time to rehearse for the next road trip. So I get called for the rehearsal. I come in, and there's Chester Thompson. So nobody told me, oh, by the way, we're going to have two drummers. Frank did whatever Frank wanted to do, and I think he just assumed that either his players are going to accept what's happening or not. And so I think that's why personnel changes in the band were numerous over the course. I think my take on it is that every musician who played in Frank's band had a point where, okay, I'm done. That's about as much as I want to do. I want to do something else, because you are working for Frank, and everything you do is for Frank and Frank's music. So if you don't want to do that, then you shouldn't be there. And so when Chester arrived at the rehearsal, it took me aback, because I kind of took it personally, because I'm thinking, well, what am I not providing what you want? Number one.
There's not many other ways to take that.
Yeah. So, but I'm not going to walk up to Frank and say, hey, what's this? I mean, I'm a sideman, and it's my choice to decide what I want to do from that point on. It was Frank's decision to change the band. It was not the only change, actually. Sal was gone. Marquez, well, actually, he was gone before then. Another guitar player was in the band now. Or was that before? I'm getting confused now with the personnel. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, so now there's two drummers. Okay. Ruth and I have discussed this a lot. What was Frank's reason for adding another drummer? And what we think is that prior to that time, we had done 10 concerts with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Very powerful. I mean, Billy Cobham. They were loud, they were fast, they were exciting, and they opened for us. Mm-hmm. So imagine me having to follow Billy Cobham on stage. That was like, oh my God, are you kidding? Meanwhile, I stood backstage every night and watched them and listened to them and just loved everything that I heard. And it taught me something. It taught me something about power. And I immediately went to the pillow on the bed in the hotel room and started practicing like crazy on a pillow, because I knew I've got to be more powerful. I'm 5'6", 135 pounds. Billy is this ex-Marine, big guy, mm-hmm. Just killing the drums and playing as fast as you can. So it had an effect on me. So
it inspired you.
It inspired me. It really did. And so I got stronger. Mm-hmm. And I remember practicing a lot more because I felt, okay, maybe I'm just not hitting hard enough. Maybe I'm not playing with enough energy, you know. So I did, and I thought my playing actually did get better after that. And what I realized is what I was able to, I had more stamina because Frank's shows were, sometimes 2.5 hours long with no intermission. And you're playing some of the hardest music one after the other, you know, for the entire night. So it took a lot of energy.
Is mentally and physically exhausted.
Oh my God, mentally and physically. Well, I finally felt like physically I was okay because I was still able to play like I want to play, still have the ability to play with a relaxation and get all my notes out without too much force and still play with a lot of power. But I think Frank, because of the power of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, he looked at his own band and said, I need more sound. And so Ruth and I feel that that's why he added another drummer. I don't think it was because I wasn't giving him something that he didn't have. That's how I ended up thinking that whole thing through.
Right.
Yeah.
He had just this other vision. And
he had another vision.
Maybe he didn't share it with everyone to the level that would have allowed him to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Frank wasn't that way. You know, it was whatever Frank wanted to do. He did it, and he didn't have to answer any questions or explain himself. And so, if you're okay with that, great. Let's move on. So I didn't go anywhere. I stayed in the band, and now I thought, okay, here's Chester, a black drummer from Baltimore, and I'm a white drummer from California, and we have nothing in common, stylistically, background, anything, and we're going to play together. So Frank left it up to us to figure that out. How are we going to coalesce? You know, how are we going to play together when we come from two different places? Chester puts it over here, I put it there. You know, how's this going to work out? Frank didn't think that through before he hired Chester Thompson. You know, he didn't come to me and say, "Look, I'm hiring this drummer, and here's some. I'm going to play you some things, and tell me what you think." He didn't do any of that. You know, so Frank didn't think that through. Maybe he felt it wasn't important. You know, that we would work it out, and we did. You know, without him really dictating how we're going to work it out, we just worked it out. And
the two of you have an incredible solo on that movie, the Roxy movie.
Yes, we do. And, you know, it's trading and, you know, that's, you know, both showing off and doing the whole thing there. But a lot of our parts were worked out. We either worked out our parts or Frank told Chester, you do this, and Ralph, you do that. You know, and then sometimes we would decide on our own, here's what we're going to do. Sometimes we'd play in unison. Sometimes we'd have different parts. But the thing that we had to learn was to play together. You know, put the beat in the same place. You know, and that required an adjustment from both of us. And it kind of was an unspoken adjustment. And I think that that says a lot about, you know, Chester and my ability to accept what's happening here and learn to play together. So it ended up being fine. I ended up liking it. And then Frank took it a step further because Chester had a sort of a little jazz set and I had my pearls. And the first thing we did, the tour we did, we wanted to distinguish one from the other in terms of tone. Style was already different, but tone was the thing. So my drums were tuned about a third lower than his drums. So we got that sort of contrast in texture and tone in the drumming. So his drums were brighter and sharper and crisper, and mine were deeper and rounder and fuller. You know, and then we played them together, and it ended up being a nice blend. But then after that tour, Frank went out and bought both of us these Ludwig, what they called Octoplus drum sets, and they were 8 mounted concert toms, double bass drum, big drums, really big drums. And so now we both had the same set, But we still decided to sort of have a contrast in the tuning.
On that decision, why did Frank make that choice? Did he want it visually to be the
I
same
don't.
on stage? Or?
Well, again, it goes back to Billy Cobham. Look at Billy's set. It's big, double bass drum, massive toms around him. So Frank wanted the visual as well, and so he got it. And and Chester and I used every drum that we had around us, and so it worked out fine. It worked out fine.
Okay, so you do this tour with the two matching drum sets.
Yeah.
Did you do any recording with that, or just the tour?
No, I don't believe we ever did. Every concert was recorded. Every concert was recorded, because I remember us grabbing the board tape and going to the hotel and playing back some of it, because we thought, well, that was good and that was good. Let's check it out. Let's see if it's as good as we thought it was. And, how do we sound? And, I think I made some mistakes here. I got to check it out. So we did a lot of that. I don't think Frank ever listened to any of the tapes, but he kept all the tapes.
Yeah, I think they're in the vault. That's
they're in the vault.
Joe's job to separate them now.
Yeah, and the whole you can't do that on stage anymore. Volumes 1 through 6, I think, or whatever. A lot of that music is board tapes from shows.
And touring with Zappa, with the Zappa band, was it as crazy as people imagine, or do you think people would be surprised at the amount of music nerdery that happens behind the closed doors?
I think for most of us in the band, it was music nerdery. Frank was Frank. I think a lot of what people would know about, life on the road. Frank was an interesting character, and but he kept to himself. I got to say that he was pretty private. He didn't go to the bar and hang out with us, and tell jokes and talk about life and all that. He didn't do any of that. He pretty much went to his hotel room and did everything in private. And the rest of us, we'd go off and do our thing. I don't recall one time hanging with Frank after a show. The times that we saw Frank were on the bus, going to the airport, on the airplane, at the rehearsals, and at the show.
Was he generous with his compliments?
No. I would say that he rarely would say anything, except if it was not right. That's when he would say something. And in fact, many times he would kick a tune off, and if he heard something he didn't like, he'd just stop the band. And, okay, let's do that again, and tell the audience, well, that wasn't quite right, let's try that again. So, yeah, he was a stickler for detail. He wanted to hear things the way he wanted to hear them. And
he was not benevolent.
Rarely gave compliments. I mean, that doesn't mean to say that he wouldn't look around on stage at somebody who was doing a solo and whatnot and be smiling and kind of enjoying what was going on. That was the extent of you getting a compliment. But he never really said anything about that.
What's the best moment that you and Frank had between you?
Wow, that's a really good question. What's the best moment? Wow. I don't know that I have an answer to that question. Because Frank, the kind of person I am, I think has a lot to do with my relationship or non-relationship with Frank. I'm not so gregarious, and I don't know. I kind of stayed my distance from Frank. I gave him the space that I think he wanted. He wasn't interested really in socializing. What was I going to talk to him about? He's the smartest guy in the room, and so I let him be to himself, and it didn't bother him. I was there when he needed me for the rehearsals. I thought I gave him what he needed from me being in the band. So it was kind of like that. I don't know that I really could say that I had any other than a professional on-stage relationship with him.
Was there a moment where he just gave you this compliment that stays with you to this day?
No. I can't remember one.
Well, he hired you for the next record, which was good. I mean, that's probably the
I
extent
guess
of
that's
his.
a compliment. Yeah, you're there. You're still there.
That's the extension of his benevolence there. So after the Roxy concerts and probably the drama, the fiasco of putting it together, the frustration that Frank had, he started going in a slightly different direction. Is that when you made the decision to try something different?
Okay, so yeah, getting back to that question. So I had the feeling that Frank was ready to move on with me. And so rather than letting him fire me, I basically just bowed out. I said, okay, thank you. I'm heading on to the next thing, whatever that was. So I just basically, ended it there. I think it was a combination of a couple things. I had done enough with the band to satisfy me with what I got out of that whole experience. I mean, it was challenging, it was rewarding. I got to play on some great stuff. I got to play with great musicians, got to see the world, a lot of things. But I think at that point, my decision, okay, do I want to continue going on with this? And what does that mean? I mean, now, is this going to be a career? Being with Frank's band? And I wasn't into that. I had other things I wanted to do.
You felt you'd learned what you were meant to learn, and it was a point of diminishing return at that point?
Well, I think so. I think it just seemed like it was time to leave. And so I did. And at the same time, I had a feeling that Frank was ready for me to leave. It's kind of weird, but that's how I felt.
And what was the last conversation you had with Frank?
I can't remember.
Was it back in the day, or did you in the 80s? Did you pick up the phone at all?
I'm sorry. Okay, the very last conversation I had with Frank was when he was at Warner Brothers recording with the group from Europe. And I can't remember the name. That there was a chamber ensemble he was recording with some of his music, and he was very sick.
Was he Yellow Shark?
No, way after that. This was maybe only 3 or 4 months before he died. So that's the last time I saw him, and I did chat with him briefly, and he was very cordial, and knew that his time was short. I mean, it was just no question. He knew what was going on, and that was the last time I saw him.
You saw him or phoned him?
No, I saw him.
Oh, okay.
I saw him because I was recording in another studio at Warner Brothers, and I knew that he was recording in another studio, and so I went over, and some of us went over to see him, and he came out and greeted us and said hi and told us what he was doing, and that. So yeah, and he was not looking well at all.
So you had that bit of closure at the end.
I did. I was able to sort of see him, and how you doing, Frank? I'm glad you're recording this music. It's fantastic. It's once again, it's it's a legacy. He's sort of left a legacy for all of us to enjoy.
Well, that's wonderful that you were able to have that moment. And you then, I mean, obviously your career didn't stop there. You've gone on to play with many, many other artists. What are some of the highlights post Frank, and what are the things that you learned playing with Frank that you were able to apply in some of your future gigs?
Well, believe it or not, a lot of the future gigs sort of had nothing to do with the kind of music I was playing with Frank.
You weren't able to do those sort of triplicate drum fills with Barbra Streisand?
Exactly. There were some bands in town that I started playing with that were challenging in nature. I did a little recording with the Fowlers. They had a band. Chester did some recording with them, and there were some other groups that were playing some challenging music that I started doing. The guitarist Mike Miller, in particular, was one of my favorite guitar players. He writes some great music, and we actually started playing together probably in the late '70s, and then recorded an album in the '80s, actually in the '90s. So throughout the whole '80s, I was playing with him, casually, and at school at Musicians Institute in Hollywood, where I started teaching in 1980, and did a lot of playing in school with Mike Miller and a lot of others. Some really challenging stuff, Scott Henderson and the like, and always enjoyed playing challenging music. Always have had that sort of desire to kick myself in the butt and make sure I don't get too complacent, and and at the same time I was doing some other gigs that were, basically, well, Seals and Crofts, for example, on the road with Seals and Crofts, doing their music, which required a whole other sensibility, because I was beginning to record more pop, rock, if you will, kind of music, that required more discipline in terms of, well, there was plenty of discipline in Frank's band, but I mean, you had to come up with a part, and it had to sound like this can get on the radio, and so, you got to watch the kind of fills you're playing. You can't get too crazy. You got to lay it in there and play that role of a session drummer. So I started learning how to do that, and ended up, doing a lot of that kind of work. And so I played with Seals and Crofts on the road for a while, and then in the '80s, an old friend of mine, Jay Graydon, who guitar player producer, who was in Don Ellis's band with me, he and David Foster, a great production team, started producing, and so he put me on a couple of records. One was a record by Mark Jordan, a Canadian singer, and then the other one was Al Jarreau, called This Time. And so I'm on that record along with people like Steve Gadd and Jeff Porcaro. And so I started doing more of that kind of stuff, which I really, really enjoy. I love R&B, and I think it's a strength of mine. And so I did a lot of that, and then I did some pop stuff with different groups, and also played with the Manhattan Transfer and recorded with them. So on the jazz side of things, I was doing a lot of that because my background is jazz, and so it was nice to get back to some of that. So I like a mixed bag of styles. So I was reaching for anything that was going to challenge me. So I started working with this Latin band in downtown LA, East LA. I wanted to learn more about all that. So I played in that band for a while, and ended up playing in this rehearsal band in Los Angeles. This character called Jerry Gallion. A true rehearsal band means that you're challenging everybody in the band. So he would write charts in 5 sharps, 6 sharps, odd meters, crazy rhythms, crazy kind of quasi-Latin beats. It was really quite fun, and I have to say the music was, very interesting and challenging, because he had us reading stuff and for no other reason than to just rehearse and play. I think we did maybe a couple gigs, but that was about it. So I kind of stayed in town more. I would still go on the road for brief stints at a time with Manhattan Transfer or Al Jarreau or some other people. I did a pretty long stint with Paul Anka. So I did a lot of that kind of stuff too.
It's great that you've been able to take your skill set, your art, and make a living out of it, and a good living, and continue to push yourself and to grow, and of course teaching as well, passing that knowledge onto others. It really is commendable. It's a hard trick to do, and you've done an incredible job, Ralph.
Well, that all started long ago when I was, again, going back to Don Ellis days. That band was doing totally unique stuff. It really had never been done before, and so a lot of the drummers in town who were sort of hungry for something new They'd gone through all the traditional books and whatnot, and a lot of them were jazz players and all that. But I was doing something unique, and so they would start calling me up and saying, "What the hell are you doing? What is that? Can you show me something?" So, and I kind of formulated a concept based on being in the band and based on studying some Indian technique with Hari Har Rao, an Indian tablaist and sitarist, with Don, a little bit with Emil Richards, a little bit with Joe Porcaro, and then what I picked up on my own, and I have a concept, and there's a drum book, method book called Even in the Odds that came out in 1980 that basically is the result of my time with Don Ellis and Frank Zappa. And so I was able to codify my experiences and put it in a book form. And then a lot of my teaching comes from the concepts that I learned. And so I pass that stuff on to my students, and it's worked very well. I mean, I really get great feedback from them. I see that it works for them. I see that they understand what it is, but it's not traditional. It definitely is not Western traditional ways of learning music or rhythm. So that was really an important thing, and it threw me into private teaching and then eventually public teaching, because Joe Porcaro, my partner now for 35 years, I guess, we started the drum program at the Musicians Institute in Hollywood called the Percussion Institute of Technology, and we were there for 15 years developing curriculum and whatnot, and then we left there in '96 and came over here to Pasadena and started the program here, and we've been here ever since. And so we continue to develop curriculum, and I continue to pass on my knowledge to my students, and my feeling is, they need to know everything that I know. If I can teach them everything I know, then that's my job. There's no secrets. I don't want to hold anything back. It's just, will they understand what I'm trying to give them? That's the thing that I hope that they get. And so teaching has been a part of my life for a long time. It's a very valuable part of my life.
Being able to see some of those students and to watch them grow and to watch them evolve must be incredibly satisfying.
It really is. I mean, many of my students have gone on to become professionals in the field and great drummers, and they all thank me for passing along what I passed along to them. And they feel that it was definitely valuable information that they continue to use, and so it's quite rewarding to get that kind of feedback and to know that I had something to do with their career.
All right, well, Ralph, that really do want to thank you for joining us on the Vinyl Guide podcast, and your stories and your background of your time, particularly with Zappa, but also your work in teaching and your other gigs has really been quite interesting. Really do want to thank you for spending the time with us, and we do appreciate it.
Hey, well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for getting in touch with me. I'm happy to share whatever stories and knowledge or whatever that I have with you and the listening public out there. I just know that what I do is really important to me. It's who I am. I've been able, like you said, to have a sort of a creative career, but at the same time be able to work in the field, and that's a kind of a trick. Sometimes sometimes it's either or.
It's good to work and to eat.
That's right. Work, eat, and play. Have a good time while you're doing all this. So thank you so much for this interview. I really enjoyed it.
Much appreciated. Cheers.
Okay.